Good afternoon, Jim. We are back for episode 4 of season 11, and we're going to start this episode, Jim, with a retraction. We don't often do that on Equip. That's because you very rarely get things wrong, Jim. But in this case, this is a very important retraction.
It is.
Do tell us what.
Well, you sprang a question on me, I think, at the last episode about the most dangerous thing I had ever done in my life. And I told you about the slingshot mechanism I went on in Cyprus. And I said that I experienced 8G of gravitational force. And apparently, if I had, my brains would have come down through my nostrils. I think the real answer was 4G. So I was guilty of gross exaggeration.
Yeah, I did think 8G sounded particularly intense, but I was impressed. I was suitably impressed.
Yeah, well, 4G... I mean, it would have been impressive because I think a fighter pilot gets about 6 or 7.
Okay, well, our listeners are very forgiving people, Jim. So I'm sure. I suspect there's probably already a few tweets out there about that.
Somebody did explain to me that I had got it wrong.
Did they?
Yeah.
Okay. So we've already had complaints coming in. We've heard you, dear listeners. But please keep them coming because I enjoy it immensely. And if there's anything else that Jim says that we need to pick him up on, do let me know and we'll issue more retractions in due course. But Jim, no, thank you for your humility there. That was was a beautiful moment. We have been looking at. Is it the darkest episode of Equip? The darkest season of Equip we've done so far?
I think so. Yes.
It certainly has felt. It's felt pretty dark at times.
And this one's going to be the worst.
Oh well. You've really teed us up nicely there. We've talked about this idea, the post-war consensus, Jim. That's a phrase that has come up a lot. So I just want to remind listeners about what that means because it's key to our episode today. So the post-war consensus can be summed up in the phrase, never again. Western elites were determined to build a society that could never return to the horrors of fascism. So we talked about the old, strong gods of virtue, solidarity, family, and truth, and these were effectively banished, and in their place were set the weak gods of softness, openness, and cynicism towards authority. So our listeners will probably remember that from our previous episodes. Society had been designed to be this atomized collection of individuals. There was no concept of the common good, and the concept of the nation was deliberately reduced to a procedural administration, a territory with porous borders. And questions about identity and belonging no longer operated at the national level. It was one's ethnicity which determined identity and belonging.
We saw in our last episode that the post-war consensus produced nations that were, in effect, spiritually bankrupt. They had opened their borders to allow large-scale immigration from Muslim countries. And so the great experiment called multiculturalism failed. But the West no longer had the spiritual or moral resources to create social cohesion or any sense of national solidarity.
And it seems that the post-war consensus has actually been something of a disaster for the West. And it's inevitably triggered a reaction. It's led to the rise of ethno-nationalism, which we discussed, I believe, last week at some length. And the very concept that the post-war consensus was designed to prevent from happening has now arisen.
This entire season is called Men of the West because we're trying to analyse 2 intertwined crises. The political crisis facing the West that we've just been talking about, but then the spiritual crisis over masculinity. And we've called this episode Pagan Men because we're going to discuss how the post-war consensus has also created the crisis over masculinity. But before we get into this episode, there's one aspect of last week's discussion that I want to finish off. This is not a retraction. I just want to finish something off. Right? So when we talked about all this stuff, I placed the blame for the post-war consensus firmly on the progressive left. And I stand by that position. The long march through the institutions, the takeover of the media, academia, politics and education was a project of the neo-Marxist left. But the post-war consensus was a consensus. And there was one aspect of the new society that was built not by the left, but by the political right. I'm talking about the new global economy. So it was right-wing economists like Friedrich Hayek and Milton Friedman who designed what we might call the global free market. And they used the free market to help build an open society. That was one of the reasons they built it. Friedman argued that an atomized society, a society in which the individual is king, could best be built using a market. The market is a wonderful thing, he said. It allows us to express our beliefs and convictions as personal preferences, which in turn can be satisfied through collaboration and exchange with others. He called it a miraculous Leviathan. He was ripping off Hobbes at the time. But anyway, the market achieves universal rule, but never exercises authority. No need for authoritarian national rulers to impose their values on everyone. It's the market which brings order to society without enforcing any moral ideal from above.
Would you argue, though, that the global free market also bears a lot of responsibility for the immigration levels we've seen in recent times?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I said last week that nations were amoral power blocks, but the same thing can be said of huge global corporations like Apple or the big pharma companies. They have no loyalty to a nation. So most of them like Western countries because those countries have, no civil unrest, they have strong contract law, sound money. But then they use the global market to import cheap labour into the West, or else they outsource their operations to countries like China. And globalisation has transformed Western economies, and a lot of that transformation has not been good. I don't know if you heard it, Ollie, but J.D. Vance made a really thoughtful speech recently, and he accused big corporations of using cheap labour instead of generating real innovation in robotics and AI and automation. And I think he's quite right on that point. So what I'm saying here is that the mess we find ourselves in today can't be blamed entirely on the progressive left. It was right-wing economists who drove the whole globalisation agenda, and that economic concept has done serious damage to our societies. Now, there's nothing wrong, as I said last week, in principle with immigration. It can be a source of innovation for any nation, but the scale and the pace of immigration driven by this globalisation and the global market has created what can only be described as a political crisis.
Okay, so we're going to now leave the conversation about the political consequences of the post-war consensus behind, and we're going to turn our attention to the crisis over masculinity. The strong gods cast aside by the post-war consensus comprised many of the principles that are most important to men.
Yes. To be a man of noble virtue, to stand shoulder to shoulder with other men in defence of something that has transcendent value, to build and protect a family, to stand courageously for truth. But now men find themselves in a feminised society, in a culture based on empathy and consensus building. I think I said in episode 2 that our society now operates using the tactics of mean girls. So whenever a man steps towards the strong gods, he's immediately labelled as a crypto-fascist. The policies of the progressive left have not only wrecked Western society, but they have built a culture in which men can no longer act as men.
In 2009, a blog called the Manosphere was launched. The term Manosphere was then adopted by disparate groups of men who were disillusioned about their place in the world. The Manosphere was almost exclusively an online phenomenon, but then a character called Anthony Dream Johnson began to organize annual men's conferences across the US. The speakers included MMA fighters, fitness coaches, pickup artists, men's rights groups who lobbied for changes to divorce laws, and traditional conservatives who spoke about fatherhood. But this online world of disillusioned men at its heart was a response to male loneliness. Young men were craving belonging, purpose, fathers and mentors who would help them make sense of life.
Your point about male loneliness is well made. Friendship rates around the world are dropping. There was a 2023 study in the US which reported that 2/3 of men aged 18 to 23 said, "No one really knows me." I think that's very sad. Or there's another study, I think from 1990, the share of men who lack a single close friend has quadrupled. 1 in 5 unmarried men say they have no close friends.
That is very sad indeed. And Jim, when we come to this area, this space, the challenge is it's very difficult to make sense of such a wide range of different men's issues. So tell us how we're going to structure this conversation.
Okay, well, I think there's one underlying cultural issue. So we're going to talk about that first. And then I'm going to suggest that the Manosphere offers 5 different versions of masculinity. Now, all the 5 ideas are pagan. That's why we've called this episode Pagan Men. And some of the ideas, I have to warn you, are horrible and dangerous. But before we get into the 5 ideas, we need to think sympathetically about this underlying cultural problem that has given rise to the Manosphere.
So when we get to the 5 visions of masculinity, we'll meet some of the main characters in the Manosphere scene, men like Andrew Tate and Nick Fuentes. We'll also talk about the red pill and incel movements. But let's start with the underlying cultural challenge that triggered the manosphere. You've called that father hunger. Can you tell us what you mean by that term?
Well, let me start by telling you about the maddest book I have ever read. Now, it's not the worst book. That accolade goes to a book called Gender Trouble by Judith Butler. But the maddest book is written by a man called Robert Bly, and it's called Iron John. And I sat in Costa Coffee at Sprucefield on Wednesday, muttering, "This man is insane," every few minutes.
That's what people probably thought about you as they heard you muttering that.
They probably did. But mixed in with the madness, there were some nuggets of genuine wisdom. Iron John was a bestseller in the 1990s when New Age thinking was fashionable. It sold millions of copies, and it built a key foundation of the Manosphere. Bly is what is called a mytho-poet. Okay, he takes myths, the Arthurian legend or Beauty and the Beast or some of the Greek myths, and he takes these old myths and he then interprets them with lunatic confidence, psychologically.
Yeah, lunatic confidence can get you places. So Iron John is the name of one of these myths, then?
That's right. Now, there is some heavyweight philosophy behind his approach because he bases his work on the ideas of Carl Jung, the Swiss psychologist.
Okay, and Carl Jung's ideas, they really form the basis of Jordan Peterson's work, don't they?
They do, absolutely. But we'll get to Jordan Peterson in a minute. Carl Jung's big idea is called the archetype. Okay, he claims that there are ancient psychological patterns called archetypes that have been embedded into our minds, and they shape how we feel and how we act and how we relate to others. Now, the archetypes aren't roles that we play. They're more like primordial energies that shape our lives. And Jung's big idea is that as these archetypes develop in boys and girls, they cause our self-consciousness to bloom like a flower. Now, for boys and men, there are 4 main archetypes. They're called the warrior, the magician, the lover, and the king.
Okay, I can tell already this is going to get weird.
as the people in Costa Coffee found out. Now, if we take these 4 energies, right, if they develop healthily and they are in balance with each other, then, according to Jung, the boy will develop into an integrated, well-adjusted man. But if they don't develop, or if they get out of balance, then a man's personality will fragment. Now, remember, Jung is really defining what masculinity is and how it develops with all this stuff, okay? So let's start with the warrior. The warrior archetype, he says, is disciplined and determined. He protects what matters. He loves the rush of adrenaline, the joy of noble sacrifice. He values courage and daring. And he achieves transcendent meaning when his field of battle is the battle between good and evil. Now, if the warrior does not develop within a boy's self-understanding, then there will be long-term damage to his masculinity. I mean, let's take a boy from a broken home who has perhaps suffered abuse. Someone like that will never develop his warrior spirit. He feels invaded, paralyzed. In a word, he sees himself as a victim. Other boys may develop their warrior spirit in a dark direction, becoming brutal and cruel or lashing out to maintain control.
Okay, and there are 3 more archetypes. Can you tell us about those as well, please?
Okay, I'll skate quickly over 2 of them because we need to get to the king archetype, right?
I'm very much looking forward to that.
So we'll think about the magician first. The magician is the thinker, okay? He helps a boy make sense of the world. Boys with a well-developed magician archetype become scientists or strategists. And then there's the lover. The lover is about passion and beauty and intimacy. He pours his soul into the creative side of life. And without the lover, everything becomes mechanical and transactional. But the lover archetype too can go dark, degrading into addiction. An unceasing search for sensation. Anyway, let's quickly move on to the king. The king is the center. He leads not with ego, but with stability. Okay, he blesses and he builds. He doesn't chase power. He radiates it. He's grounded and present and anchored. And the king creates an ordered space in which the boy can dwell. Now, here is the key point. The king is born when the warrior is disciplined, the magician is wise, and the lover is alive.
Again, you've mentioned a few of these archetypes can go dark, and I guess that raises the question, what happens if the king archetype goes dark?
Yeah, he becomes a tyrant who's fearful of losing control. I mean, I think we'll probably all know people like this. he destroys what he cannot control. Or else, on the other side, he becomes a weakling. Now, I'm quite sure some of our listeners are tempted to join me in muttering, this is all quite mad. But although it is pagan, it does in some sense help us understand what masculinity is. Masculinity is about taking responsibility without control. It is that unique set of qualities which allows men to confront the unknown. And I think we can see how these four energies within a man, if they're underdeveloped or if they go dark, can ruin a man's personality. So it's really quite helpful, I think, to look at a boy and ask if his warrior, his magician, and his lover archetypes are developing so that when he matures, an inner king is born. In other words, a grounded, present, and anchored personality, one that doesn't chase power but which radiates it, has grown within him. And in so doing, the king creates an ordered space for himself and those under his care. Now, in actual fact, when I thought about this, Jung's scheme isn't actually a million miles away from the three pictures which the Apostle Paul gives to his son in the faith, Timothy, of mature manhood: the warrior, the athlete, and the farmer.
So how do these Jungian archetypes lead us to this concept of father hunger then?
Well, this brings us to Iron John.
At last, at long last.
The myth of Iron John is about a boy who lives in a palace. And for some complicated reasons that I can't quite understand, there is a wild, hairy man of the forest who has been imprisoned in a cage in the courtyard of the palace. Now, the wild man isn't a savage, but he isn't the sort of person to sip tea in the palace drawing room. Now, here's the thing. The key to his cage is kept under the pillow of the boy's mother's bed. Freud would have a field day with that bit of the story. But the boy steals the key, releases the wild man, and journeys with him to the dark forest. Now, it's obviously a picture of the boy leaving the safety of his mother's domain and entering the domain of masculinity. Are you understanding this myth?
I barely, but clinging on by my fingernails, Jim, if I'm honest.
Now, it's an important moment in the boy's life, and the key figure in his development into a man with an inner king, a man with a warrior who's disciplined, and a wise magician, and a lover who's alive. The key figure is his father. Okay? Now, let's think about fathers. Think back to the time before the Industrial Revolution, to the days when a son could watch his father work every day on the farm. The father could teach his son real skills, how to plough a field, how to fix a broken gate. He would teach him how to gut a fish, how to shave. And over time, the son's psyche becomes attuned to his father's masculine spirit. I'm sounding so new age here. I really am. But anyway, I think there's some truth in it. So the boy's soul begins to resonate, with that. I don't know how you would describe it. The sort of demanding, humorous, competent, driving spirit of masculinity. But his father would do more than teach. He would bless his son. And when I was reading all this nonsense, suddenly a thought came into my mind. I was thinking about that amazing moment in Mark's Gospel when Jesus has just been baptized and the heavens open and God the Father says, "This is my beloved Son. In him I am well pleased." Now, there are millions of young men in this world who long for a blessing like that. They long to hear their dad say, "This is my beloved Son. In him I am well pleased."
So is your argument, Jim, that this father hunger is the experience of young men who haven't been taught or blessed by their fathers?
That's exactly right. That's what I'm saying. I talked about a son's soul becoming attuned to his father's masculine spirit. Without that sort of resonance, then father hunger develops. There is a lack of psychological protein in the son's diet, if you like. Without it, a deep, nameless shame settles in the son's mind. He secretly accepts the diminished idea of father. And he's ashamed because he knows he will propagate it onwards. And because of this secret, he experiences internal collapse and lives with a sort of numb place inside him.
And so you're pointing us towards what has been called the absent father problem. But I guess when we think about that idea, we sort of become aware that fathers can be absent in lots of different ways.
That's right. 25% of boys in the United States now live in a home with no father. But even when the father lives at home, he can be absent. Since the days of the Industrial Revolution, fathers have left home each day and gone to work. Their sons can't watch them work. They can't see dad in action. So the son only receives the father's temperament, not his teaching. And that temperament is often not healthy. Dad returns home in a tired and irritable state. And here's the point. The father as a living force in the home has disappeared. Now, perhaps the most important sense of the absent father is at the level of culture. And this point brings us back to the post-war consensus. Just about every point I make brings us back to the post-war consensus.
Yeah, there is. I think I'm going to be dreaming about it.
Because here's the point. The open society is feminized. The patriarchy is seen as a proto-fascist idea. So now, here's a little thought experiment. Consider every father figure portrayed in sitcoms over the last 20 years. Dads are weak and foolish and bumbling. They're often objects of ridicule. Women and children outwit them in every scene. It's actually been really interesting to read some of this mythological stuff, because in many ways, it's the complete opposite of what we see in our culture. The father figure in myth is the son's first king. He's this luminous Arthurian figure who brings down light from the sun into family life. That's what the myths talk about. The son perceives the father as bright. He seeks to emulate his father, to become as bright as he is, to reach to his height. But in our culture, the father sits around the dinner table, a diminished and weakened figure. And that is the real father hunger. There are no father figures in society who can teach and bless young men. Fathers are portrayed as weak. Or worse, they're presented as the dark father. Now, I'm going to intrigue you here. Perhaps the most famous father-son relationship in modern cinema is found in the Star Wars series. Yes, in the famous line from The Empire Strikes Back, Darth Vader stands in front of Luke Skywalker and says, "I am your father." But think carefully about the name Darth Vader. Robert Bly points out that it's an obvious play on the phrase dark father. So that's the other father figure depicted in culture, the dark father, who's the opposite of the luminous figure who draws down light from the sun.
Canadian psychologist Jordan Peterson speaks into this problem more than anyone else, and he became famous for standing up against the enforced speech of the progressive left way back in 2014. But it was his book 12 Rules for Life, published in 2018, which propelled him onto the world stage. His YouTube videos have been viewed millions of times, and hundreds of thousands of young men flock to him speak at live events.
We've talked about Jordan Peterson in previous seasons, and I have genuine respect for the man. I think young men saw him as a father figure. He was a wise man who actually listened to them and understood them and wanted to bless them. Just about everything he says is based on the Jungian psychology that we have just discussed.
And as a social scientist, Jordan Peterson is a little bit like a secular priest or pastor. He understands that young men are lost, that they hunger for meaning and significance.
Yes, and if you listen to him, what he's doing is taking them on this inward journey of self-discipline, training their inner warrior, magician, lover and king to produce a well-ordered soul. And he does that by using myths to reconnect disoriented people to their roots. Now, he uses the Bible as a source of myths, the way Robert Bly uses Iron John. Okay? I watched a BBC programme about Peterson in which he was taken to a boxing club in one of the toughest, most deprived parts of England, one of the big cities up north. And it was actually really quite moving. Some of these lost boys had found purpose and meaning by joining a club which gave them father figures who instilled discipline into them. And Peterson said simple but really profound things to those boys. He says, "You don't make men harmless by making them weak. You make them useful by bringing their capacity for mayhem under strict conscious self-control." Or he said, "It's almost impossible to do disciplined and difficult things without a goal. Responsibility is what gives life meaning." Now, young men will always respond to that sort of stuff. It's good stuff. But here's the problem. When it's all said and done, Peterson can only offer self-help advice. Make your bed. Stand up tall. His message, when all the mythology is stripped away, reduces to a self-help manual. And that road is a cul-de-sac. I was thinking about this. If I had to define masculinity in 3 sentences, this is what I would say. A man takes responsibility for things he cannot control. A man steps into the unknown to bring order to the world. A man protects, nourishes, and develops those he loves. Now, the first statement I made only makes sense within a Christian worldview. how can we take responsibility for things that we cannot control? The only way to square that circle is through faith. So a real man is a man of faith, not a self-sufficient man. Because the self-sufficient man can only take responsibility for things he can control. And the world is too complicated for that. So while Jordan Peterson is a well-intentioned man, and I think he's done quite a lot of good, I don't think he has any real answers.
We've thought about the underlying cultural problem then of father hunger. Let's turn now to the 5 visions of masculinity offered by the Manosphere. And you've given these 5 concepts quite strange and somewhat intriguing names, Jim, which is to be expected.
Yes, because I've been reading all this New Age stuff. That's why I've gone with this. So we're going to talk about the ornament, the misogynist, the nihilist, the overman, and the conspirator.
Okay, wow, quite a lineup. It sounds like a sort of alternative to the Fantastic Four or something. Some sort of new superhero group.
Yes, we've invented a multiverse.
So can we discuss each of those in turn?
Yes. Now it's important to remember that all 5 of these visions of masculinity are pagan. Okay, that's why we've called this episode Pagan Men. And the first vision I'm suggesting is the concept of ornamentation. Man as an ornament. At the top of this episode, I talked about globalization. It was right-wing economists who promoted the idea that a global free market would be a brilliant way to create open societies. We can use free markets to build this atomized society where the individual consumer is king. So we wouldn't need national leaders to give us top-down moral cause. The market will allow each of us to express our own values and beliefs as the choices of a consumer. And that strategy has been frighteningly successful. But it has come at a terrible cost. Because we have moved into what is called late-stage capitalism. And let me explain that term. Late-stage capitalism has reduced everything to commodities that can be bought and sold in the free market. And if that all sounds very abstract, let me explain it in one phrase. OnlyFans. The OnlyFans pornography company, it only has 46 employees, and yet it has generated nearly 8 billion revenue last year. It is the most profitable company in the world. And it works by commoditizing sex in the global marketplace. Now, that is an extreme example of a general problem. Everything in life has been commoditized, reduced to something that can be bought and sold. So all of us are reduced to market actors whose lives are shaped by what we buy and sell. The world has become a marketplace. And here's my point. There is one product that we can all sell. Ourselves. So let me try and illustrate this. Consider the difference between a battered old frying pan and a china ornament on the drawing room mantelpiece. The frying pan is a utensil. Okay, it works away in the kitchen doing useful things. It finds purpose in serving the needs of others. But an ornament, on the other hand, does nothing. It just has to look good. It only exists to be admired. And that's the source of its value. A thing that makes people envious. People who say, I wish I had one of those. Men used to be frying pans. There's a sentence I never thought I would utter. Kitchen utensils who had a purpose because they did useful things. But the Manosphere encourages men to see themselves as ornaments. Men exist to be admired, to make other men envious of their success. Today, manhood is defined by appearance, by youth and attractiveness, by money and aggression, by posture and swagger, by the curled lip, the petulant sulk, and the flexed biceps. The old vision of masculinity gave men a sense of purpose in society, but an ornamental culture wipes all that away. We used to work together in teams to achieve real goals. Now men posture in front of an iPhone as an act of selling the self. So this is the first pagan vision of masculinity. It teaches men to reduce themselves to ornaments to be admired.
And could you argue that an obvious example of man as an ornament is someone like Andrew Tate? So he presents himself as a high-status alpha male who's made millions of pounds, drives around in fast cars and flies on private jets. And he boasts about his sexual conquests, all to project this image that's designed to attract young men. He promises that they can have his lifestyle as well.
Andrew Tate is an ornament. He sells himself as an object to be admired and envied. In his part of the manosphere, attention is the only currency. So he deliberately makes outlandish and outrageous statements. He claims to work for Mossad, the Israeli intelligence agency. He claims to be worth over 100 million. So the man is clearly a fantasist. But the reason he is such a good illustration of my point is how he makes money. He's developed this online course called the Hustle University. Do you know this?
I don't know this.
Yes, the Hustle University. And so young men pay $50 per month to join. Now, the course itself is entirely useless. But Tate has set Hustle University up as a pyramid scheme. People make money by selling membership of Hustle University to other young men. And they do this by creating admiring TikTok videos for Tate as a way to sell it. It's a completely cynical scam. But my main point is that the man is an ornament. He has reduced himself to an object that he parades in order to induce envy in others. Andrew Tate doesn't actually do anything. He exists to market himself.
Yeah, and he's also notorious for his gross misogynistic statements about women. And that leads us into the Manosphere's second vision of masculinity, which is the misogynist.
Yes, unfortunately we have to talk about this because sex is central to everything in the Manosphere. Sex is the root of a man's sense of self, we're told, his achievement and happiness. But because of the post-war consensus, men must now live in a feminized world. And in the Manosphere, the name given to such a society is the Longhouse. Have you heard of this? The Longhouse. Longhouses were communal, multi-family dwellings built by ancient cultures that were matriarchal. Okay, so a society that's in the Longhouse bows to feminine social norms. Those who live outside the Longhouse, in the words of Hillary Clinton, are the deplorables. Now, according to the misogynist, there is a secret about life in the Longhouse. A secret about how women really think about sex and relationships. In the language of the Manosphere, men who have taken the red pill become aware of this secret.
Okay, and that idea of the red pill, that seems quite popular online. As I understand it, it's a concept taken from the film The Matrix. So in the film, the main character, Neo, is offered the choice of taking a red pill or a blue pill. Taking the red pill frees Neo from the control of the Matrix, allowing him to escape into the real world. If he'd taken the blue pill, he would have lived in the illusory dream world, injected into his cortex in the prison of the Matrix.
Yes, I really must watch that film sometime. But anyway, in this case, those who take the red pill discover that harmless, nice guys are destined for heartbreak because deep down their girlfriends and wives prefer reckless bad boys. That allegation is shocking enough on its own. But the red pill takes things a step further. It teaches that men only embody the nice guy archetype because they've been manipulated by their feminist mothers and the Longhouse culture. Men who never question their programming end up as blue-pilled betas, effeminate boys deprived of their masculine birthright. They're guys that women settle for and marry, but never desire. And these are supposedly the predominant type of men today. And by contrast, men who take the red pill awaken to these hidden truths, and now imbued with secret knowledge, men of the Manosphere train to grow in physical, financial and sexual power. The promise is that by shedding beta programming and becoming alphas, the men will transform into objects of women's desire, and this transformation apparently will make women submissive, and men will triumph over the Longhouse culture.
And it's certainly a horrible and misogynistic view of the world, Jim, and some of the statements made by Andrew Tate and Nick Fuentes we wouldn't even want to repeat or draw attention to.
No, it's absolutely a sick world. Again, where attention is the only currency. So edginess is the only way to gain a following. But teenagers and young men are drinking this ghastly stuff in. And at the same time, of course, they're watching pornography, some of it violent porn. So a young man's ability to forge a healthy, mutually respectful relationship with a woman is undermined. Misogyny arises from a second source in the Manosphere. And so I just need to point this out because some of the men in this camp are older. They're divorced guys who feel that the laws around alimony and child custody are unfair to men. And I've read a few cases which made me feel a measure of sympathy for their plight. So that's one group. But for the most part, the Manosphere is irrationally and crudely misogynistic.
So we've thought about the ornament and the misogynist. Now let's consider the third option for masculinity found in the Manosphere, the nihilist.
Okay, for our purposes, I'm going to define nihilism as an ideology that claims that life has no meaning or purpose. It also claims that there are no objective morals. There's nothing valuable in life. The word literally means an ideology of nothing, and it is an entirely bleak worldview, one that often leads to despair. Nihilism is embraced by those who have had a complete breakdown of faith in God or even in an ideology. Now, we've already seen that money and sex are idolized within the Manosphere. But what happens when a young man fails to get either? Well, he collapses into grievance and bitterness. He's left as a weak man, imprisoned in the longhouse.
Young men in this state often describe themselves as incels, and incel is short for involuntary celibate. Incels become obsessed with the significance of love, sex, and intimacy, but they fail to realize that potential.
That's right. Nihilism can express itself in one of two ways, either as rage or despair. So let me tell you a true story. Elliot Rodger was a young man from a wealthy family. His father was English, his mother Chinese. And Rodger was a self-professed incel. In 2014, he posted a manifesto. And in it he said this: "All of my suffering in this world has been at the hands of humanity, particularly women. It has made me realize just how brutal and twisted humanity is as a species. All I ever wanted was to fit in and live a happy life amongst humanity, but I was cast out and rejected, forced to endure an existence of loneliness and insignificance, all because the females of the species were incapable of seeing the value in me." After he had posted this manifesto, Rodger stabbed 3 men to death. He then drove to a sorority house in the University of California. By God's grace, he couldn't force his way in, but he shot 3 young women. 2 of them died. He then went on a shooting rampage, killing other people at random until he eventually crashed the car and shot and killed himself. And a psychologist who investigated the case said this: "Rodger's murderous rage was rooted in an obsessive self-hatred, born from his belief that he was entitled to and thwarted from obtaining a trifecta of privileges: race, class, and gender. He saw himself as not quite white enough, not quite rich enough, not quite masculine enough, at least in the toxic, testosterone-saturated way that the term is defined in our society."
The other form of nihilism, called passive nihilism, arises when a young man's values and his value as a human being is questioned.
Yes, incels don't just express disgust and despair of the world, they are disgusted by themselves, their looks, their body, their personality, or their intelligence. I even hesitate to say this, Ollie, but on the Reddit platform, there is a thread called the Incel Graveyard. It contains hundreds of suicide notes. Some of them are the saddest messages I have ever read. I certainly won't repeat any of them, but they're heartrending. I hope that listeners can see now why the Manosphere is such a terrible place. So you thought about the ornament and the misogynist, and the nihilist exists because of the other 2 pagan visions of masculinity. An incel wishes that he could be an ornament. He's taken the red pill and now believes that no woman would ever look twice at him, and so he embraces nihilism.
The fourth type of masculinity offered by the Manosphere is the overman. Tell us what that's about.
Okay, I'm going to go on a rant about Nietzsche at this point, okay?
That's the last thing we need at this stage.
Well, earlier we went down a philosophical rabbit hole to understand the work of Carl Jung, and I went all New Agey for a while. But we now need to go down another rabbit hole to understand some ideas of Nietzsche, the German philosopher. Lurking behind everything we talk about in this season is the philosophy of Friedrich Nietzsche. So let's think about him. He was born in 1844. He was a precociously bright guy, becoming a professor at the age of 24. But here's the thing, he is renowned for being virulently anti-Christian. So I'm going to take a few minutes to talk about his view of Christianity. And I really should apologize for this deep dive, but anyway, it's because his ideas have been really influential in the Manosphere.
The thing is, I know you're not actually sorry. That's the thing. So, there's no need to...
I'm just being polite.
So do carry on.
Well, here's the thing. Nietzsche rejected the Christian idea that morality is based on the commandments revealed in the Bible. He said that what we take to be moral depends on our biological nature. And humans have a variety of biological natures. So what one person thinks is good, another person thinks is bad. So if you are a sheep, says Nietzsche, then being able to graze peacefully and stick close to your herd, those are good things. Wolves, on the other hand, if you're a sheep, are very bad. But what if you're a wolf? If you're a wolf, then strength and viciousness and contempt for sheep are good things. There's nothing that the sheep and the wolf can agree upon morally, because their morals are determined by their different natures. Now, says Nietzsche, this type of division exists within the human race. The divide between the strong and the weak, the divide between the timid and the bold, cuts through all humanity. A few men are bold and courageous, they take risks, they assert their will over whatever the world throws at them, but most, however, are passive and meek. They tend to huddle together in herds. Now, my talk of sheep and wolves is deliberate because Nietzsche's view of morality is based on the Darwinian idea of survival of the fittest. Moral codes are part of a biological life strategy for survival. My moral code, according to him, is nothing more than a window into who I am psychologically and biologically.
Now, Nietzsche only rarely talks about sheep and wolves.
That's for me.
He more commonly talks about slaves and masters. So he divides humanity into two groups. A massive herd of slaves and a few aristocratic masters.
That's right. So he begins by asking us to compare two sets of values. Okay? So here's the first set of values. It is good to be proud of yourself. Wealth is good. Take vengeance on others. Seek great pleasures for your body. Undertake great projects. Don't worry about others. When you've accomplished something, admire yourself for what you have done. Indulge yourself in the rewards that greatness deserves. Okay, so that's the first set. The second set of values runs like this. Humility, meekness, poverty, sacrifice. Give to charity. Be forgiving and self-deprecating. Practice self-restraint. Be ashamed of your sins. Play it safe. Think of others' needs, because we're all dependent. Obey your parents. Now, the first set of values, says Nietzsche, are for masters, and the second set is slave morality. This is one of his big phrases, slave morality. But the curious fact of history is that in Europe, it is the slave morality which dominates. Now, why is this the case, Nietzsche asks. A long time ago, he says, during the Roman Empire, we used to value excellence and power and strength. We venerated the proud and the assertive. But now we value the weak, the kindly neighbour, the gentle soul. What has happened to Europe, he asks.
And so what does he think has happened? How does he think the slave morality has come to rule the masters?
Well, the real villain in Nietzsche's story is the Judeo-Christian tradition. Surprise, surprise. Now, it's interesting, he makes no distinction between the two religions, but he traces the story of the slave morality back to the moment in Israel's history when God's people were enslaved in Egypt. And here's what he says. He says, how do slaves survive? In order to survive, what policies will help a slave to live and stop him from being killed? Now, notice what he's doing here with these questions. What is good reduces to the practical matter of survival. Slave morality is a survival strategy. So, reasons the slave, it's good to obey the master. I must repress my instinct to assert my own power, stifle my impulse to seek vengeance. And over time, the slaves learn that slave virtues like humility and forgiveness and meekness have survival value, which makes them good in the eyes of a slave. But some slaves are energetic and full of vitality. They aren't as passive as the other slaves. They hate themselves for being weaklings. They know they can't take real revenge, so they create fantasy revenge. These men are full of impotent rage, and they use the slave moral code as a way to form a power base of obedient slaves. They gather other slaves around them. And Nietzsche now identifies these men. They are the priests in the Christian church. He says, priests have always been great haters. And they preach their slave morality, using it as a weapon to condemn the powerful and the rich, to instruct them to give their money away, to instill guilt within the rich. The priest's sermons are weapons in the battle of the weak against the strong. Morality is the weapon that wages war against the higher type of man, the aristocratic master, undermining the master's self-confidence. To revert to the sheep and the wolf, the sheep have persuaded the wolves to become sheep-like, or at least to be ashamed of being a wolf. Nietzsche's great heroes are the Iron Men who ran the Roman Empire. And he likens the battle against Christianity as the battle between Rome and Judea. But, he says, the slaves have won. And he points to the Vatican. And he says the chief slave ruled over the greatest master culture in human history for centuries.
Nietzsche was writing in the late 19th century. The Enlightenment had happened, Darwin had published his work, so the world had changed.
Yes, everything changed. Why? Because God is dead, Nietzsche said, as his most famous statement. Now, when he says God is dead, he isn't making a theological claim. He's giving a diagnosis of Western culture. He's saying that the Christian worldview, with its notion of objective morality, has ceased to be the governing foundation of society. The cry of God is dead for Nietzsche is a moment of freedom. It's a shout of liberty, because humans can now become their own gods and create their own values. The slaves might huddle together in terror at such a thought, but the masters are galvanized. Nietzsche now gives a name to these aristocratic masters. He calls them the Übermensch, or the Overmen.
I must say I'm relieved we finally arrived at the Overmen.
Well, thank you, and thank everyone for their patience. So the Overman says, God is dead. So the Overman says, now I become the author. I will create. I assume the responsibility to move beyond good and evil by creating a new set of values. Now, this really explains our culture today, doesn't it, with expressive individualism. But Nietzsche describes the Overman as having, physical vitality and ruthless spiritual discipline. His deepest instinct will be to act as a creative tyrant. He is a magnificent monster driven by his deep instincts, not by reason, because reason is a tool for weaklings. In Nietzsche's view, the Overman, the Übermensch, is a master of conflict and exploitation. He regards kindness and gentleness with contempt. He's more like a terrible bird of prey, capable of great cruelty, according to slave morality. He revels in his own superiority. He cares nothing about great inequality. In short, says Nietzsche, the Overman is an antichrist. And one day he will come. I think Nietzsche's Overman concept is the darkest, the most pagan concept of masculinity ever devised.
Yeah, it is. It's deeply sinister, isn't it? And do you think there is a link to the rise of the Third Reich and Hitler? Although Nietzsche himself wasn't particularly anti-Semitic, was he?
No, but his sister was, and she edited some of his books. Hitler visited her, and in fact attended her funeral in 1935. So yes, there certainly is a link to Hitler and fascism. In fact, Hitler had a bust of Nietzsche on his desk. But that's a story we'll tell in our next episode. The main reason for going down the Nietzsche rabbit hole is to explain this concept of the Overman. Because the Overman is the dark philosophical shadow that lurks in the background of the Manosphere. Pagan masculinity exults in the freedom of rebellion against God. It delights in domination, in crushing power, and ruthless predatory behaviour. In Nietzschean thought, the ultimate man is the Antichrist.
Very dark stuff indeed, Jim. To summarise, we've thought about the ornament, the misogynist, the nihilist, and the overman. The fifth and final option offered to us by the Manosphere is called the conspirator. And I slightly dread to ask, but can you tell us more about this?
I'm so sorry for dragging you through this. I mean, there is one specific conspiracy theory that pervades the Manosphere, and I'm going to talk about it in a moment, but we need to talk first about the way the online world works. Okay, so just take a typical teenager angry about dating advice, and he stumbles upon a video blaming feminism, and then he discovers the theory of the longhouse, and then another link brings him into a world which blames immigrants for the corruption of society, and so it goes on, link after link. The machine is teaching him what to hate. Now, people who use Facebook or Instagram have no idea what subterranean worlds young men inhabit. The 4chan platform, it's a bit like a stripped-down Twitter, but that is a breeding ground for conspiracy theories. The whole QAnon thing, if you remember that. So we need to remember that online platforms are not neutral utilities. They're engines of emotional manipulation. And in some cases, an online platform is little more than mechanized hate. The writer Hannah Arendt warned about masses of isolated individuals seeking meaning through shared hatred. And I think it's the ultimate sin of the open society.
Yeah, it's deeply troubling. And I think for young parents in particular, there's clear warning signs in this about controlling your children's social media consumption or online consumption or monitoring it closely. Tell us about the specific conspiracy theory that's found in the Manosphere.
So the conspiracy is peddled by the likes of Nick Fuentes. If Andrew Tate is the ornament plus the misogynist, Nick Fuentes is the misogynist plus the conspirator. And Fuentes' theory goes like this. The architects of the post-war consensus were all Jews. A global cabal of Jews decided to destroy Western civilization. They chose feminism as their chief weapon to create this soft, open society that was cynical toward authority. The Jews suppressed white birth rates via abortion and birth control. They flooded cities with minorities, mass-produced pornography, and normalized the homosexual lifestyle. But here comes the big reveal. As we discussed in episode 2, the post-war consensus was driven by the horrors of the Second World War. Never again was the cry of the architects of the post-war consensus. But Fuentes says that the Third Reich has been vilified, that the Holocaust is a fabrication, a lie spread in order to slander masculine Christian patriarchy as the foundation of fascism and genocide. Hitler was the good guy who stood up for family and blood and soil. Churchill was the villain, and the good guys lost. Now, Nick Fuentes, disgracefully enabled by Tucker Carlson, believes he and his allies are forging a new rebellion. But they are repeating history's darkest reflex, the search for scapegoats when meaning collapses.
And one of the scary things about this new anti-Semitism is that it isn't an obvious thing like going around burning synagogues. It spreads through podcasts and memes.
Yeah, that's right. It tells young men that the world is corrupt, that unseen powers have stolen their future, and that to be righteous is to be defiant. It promises belonging to the lonely and significance to the invisible. So let's just back up and draw this episode to a close. The Manosphere arose because of father hunger in culture. There are few father figures in society who can teach and bless young men. Fathers are portrayed as weak, so young men have not developed a healthy and balanced masculinity. They feel alienated from a soft, open society, forced to live in the longhouse. So the Manosphere has offered them 5 pagan visions of masculinity: the ornament, the misogynist, the nihilist, the overman, and the conspirator. Now, next week, we're going to bring all our episodes together. The post-war consensus created a weak, feminized society, the thing called the longhouse. Christians began to argue for a return of the strong gods of virtue, solidarity, family, and truth. In desperation, they turned to the old theological idea of dominionism. Dreams of a Christian nation began to stir in the political soil. But the feminization of society had triggered a second reaction, the thing called the Manosphere, with its pagan view of manhood. And we're going to see next week, these two reactions to the post-war consensus have come together. The ideas from 18th century Reformed political theology collided with the pagan view, the pagan world of the Manosphere. Dominionism fused with the pagan overmen to create the Christian nationalism that we see in the United States today. So next week's episode, which I promise will be not as dark as this one, is called The Collision.
Brilliant. Thank you, Jim. And thank you very much to all of our listeners for joining us this week. We're going to leave it there for now. Do send any questions to theequipproject@gmail.com or reach out to us over Instagram. But until next time, have a great week.